hopefully you can hear this, and I've relocated back to my old office. This should be pretty cool. Just doing some renovating back here. So we are going to finish up our anti-reflective lecture, and let me share this again. So here's where we left off. And these were the stacks, as it were, the multi-layer anti-reflective coatings. And again, if I have one specific layer of coating, it's generally going to block out one specific wavelength. Well, in order to get a better anti-reflective coating, we're going to have to add multiple layers to additionally cancel out, as it were, through destructive interference, additional wavelengths. And again, arguably, it makes sense that the more you have, the fewer reflections there will be. So if you had a less expensive, less comprehensive, fewer layer coating, it's still an anti-reflective coating, but it may not be as good as something that's more expensive, that has more applications, has more layers. And again, there are some anti-reflective coatings, and I don't like to get into brands, but there are some that you don't see anything. It's very difficult. They're incredibly effective. Other ones, it says there's an AR, but there's a massive, like a very observable green sheen, a reflection. And what that simply means is they've gotten a lot of the wavelengths, but they haven't gotten all of them. And anything that is not canceled out, you'll still see. And again, there are some that you have this very obvious green reflection. Some are gold, some are blue. Zeiss has, or had at one point, a handful of different ones you could choose from. And at some point there's blue blocking lenses. If you look, there's two ways that we block blue blocker, blue high energy visible light, HEV light, or blue light. And one of the things that we do with that is we can either absorb it through the material, which oftentimes leaves a little bit of a yellowish hue, or we can block it by selectively reflecting just that color, so that all the high energy blue light rays, the violets, the indigos, the blues, are all reflected away from the wearer. So oftentimes an anti-reflective coating arguably is one where we minimize or limit all reflections. A selective filtering thin film coat, as some ARs are, you'll see a very notable blue or purple or somewhat a notable reflection, and that's because they're trying to allow as many wavelengths through an anti-reflective coating, but selectively allowing the blue lights, or the harmful energy, the high energy visible harmful blue light, to be reflected back at where it came from. So when you're looking at something like that, it's not as effective as an AR, some of those blue light filters, some of the blue light selective filters. And I found that they're not as good for things like night driving because there is more reflected glare, but they're different coatings for different purposes. And so that's, again, you can have fewer coatings and it's not as effective. You can have more layers, it can be more effective. You can change the component, which wavelengths selectively you're filtering for in terms of what you're going to allow through and what you're going to allow to be reflected back. And arguably this thin, and we won't get into this, but the thin film deposition that we're talking about is the same type that we're doing for mirror coatings. Same application process. You still want the foundation coating, you want the hard coat, you want some type of an adhesion or a foundation coat. Then you'll have the different stacks, and you can do mirror coatings, dielectric mirror coatings. There's a cool couple companies that you can apply them onto just about any lens you want. So again, anti-reflective coatings, mirror coatings, same technology, different components to what they actually add there. Now, again, what I'd mentioned before, there's different qualities and different types of ARs. Some may have just a few stacks and they slap a few things on and they don't treat it properly, and you could throw a couple layers of these coatings on any lens, but if it doesn't adhere, if it cracks, if it peels off, if it rubs off rather, it's not going to be as high quality. So you've got to worry about durability. You have to worry about scratching. You have to worry about how it's applied. You have to worry about how easy is it to clean. And that's where it separates some of the different anti-reflective coatings. So one of the first things we do, what are the practical considerations? Well, it turns out durability. And it used to be, again, we talked about how glass lenses in a camera, glass lenses in an telescope, glass lenses in binoculars, have anti-reflective coatings put on by the Canons and the Nikons and all those companies that make them. And they're incredibly durable because the glass there and the inorganic compounds that we use, like silicon dioxide, it's almost like a glass-like thin film that you apply. There's no flexibility, there's no expansion, the coatings last pretty much forever on glass lenses. But back in the 80s, when we started trying to apply, 70s, 80s and onwards, when we started trying to apply a lens coating, these thin film depositions and multi-layer coatings onto, say, plastic, or in the 90s, the polycarbonates, it turned out that they didn't adhere that well. They would craze, they would crack, they would rub off, and it was a little bit of an issue. And part of that, I would argue that there's a couple different reasons for that. And I use the analogy of, well, if you take a look, here's a neat little picture, and this is someone whose coating has physically crazed. It cracks and crackles, and part of that is the coatings that you use, silicon dioxide, are essentially thin nanometer type thickness of almost like a glass-like material, and it's very thin. Well, if you took latex paint and put it on a soccer ball and you coated the whole thing, and that's great, but then if you deflated the soccer ball, the latex paint would sort of crackle and chip and crack in little places, and it wouldn't hold together very well because what you're putting it on, it is not flexible, but what was underneath was flexible. It's arguably the same thing for a lot of lenses. If I put a glass-like coating on a glass-like material, it doesn't flex very well, so it stays pretty durable. It doesn't flex, and so this top coating doesn't have an opportunity to crackle and crack and craze, as it were, or have adhesion issues. It turns out that one of the benefits of polycarbonate, Trivex, and other lenses, especially in impact resistance, is its flexibility. If you grind a lens that's polycarbonate too thin, you can actually start playing with the middle and start pressing down on it because it is flexible without cracking and without chipping and without shattering. That's one of the items, one of its properties that actually keeps it from, that's what keeps it, one of the issues that makes it more impact resistant. But if I have a flexible understructure and then put a coating on, that if it goes back and forth here and cracks the top coating, it just ruins the coating. So the flexibility, a lot of the high indexes of polycarbonate specifically, they're more flexible than a glass lens. There's also coefficients of thermal expansion. That's a little beyond what we do, but essentially if you go outside and it's hot and you come inside and it's cold, or vice versa, where if there's a huge expansion of temperature, different materials expand at different rates when you're given temperature changes. And it turns out there's a coefficient of thermal expansion in glass. Even when you go from hot to cold, huge swings in temperature, glass doesn't have that much of an expansion. Well, again, if I had the substrate, the base lens, the material that I'm using, and then the coating on top, if this keeps getting bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller, but the coating is more sort of locked in, this is going to start cracking, and you start seeing this effect. Well, glass, 0.71, polycarbonate, a little higher. This is my favorite, allele diglycol carbonate. I love my quiz bowls. We generally have an opti bowl for optometry and opticianry. We'd love to do that, but with the COVID pandemic, we've sort of had to put that on the back burner. But this would be a cool one. Allele diglycol carbonate is better known as, and if you don't know the name to that, it's not that common, it's CR39. We know CR39 is regular plastic. And quick question, this is one I would see. The top one I'd never ask anyone to know because it's not common. But what does CR39 stand for? And it's Columbia Resin 39. When they're trying to make these different plastics, they would try different formulations and different recipes, if you will. And when they were doing this, it was their 39th little episode, their 39th recipe, and that's what they came up with. There's some argument about it had industrial and military uses, but when we had a lot left over, it had a lot of cool properties. One of them is easy workability, good optics, those types of things. So CR39 slowly, 70s, 80s, started replacing glass as our favorite lens material. So be that as it may, that was a little tangent. So again, CR39, all these different lenses. Glass doesn't expand much. It's not very flexible. It's not bendy. And so anti-reflective coatings that are pretty easy to craze, are pretty easy to chip and crack, what have you. We need to find some way to keep a flexible material, a material that expands a lot, from cracking the coating, if you will, for lack of a better word. I'm trying to simplify this as much as I can. So the solution to this is now, in most cases, the lens itself has an additional coating. We call them foundation coatings, base coatings, what have you. And now you put the anti-reflective stack on top of that. And what it acts as is almost like a buffer. And as this is flexing and changing ever so slightly, it doesn't affect this as much. And that was a huge change. It was a huge improvement. In the 80s, we used to have anti-reflective coatings that we'd apply to a CR39 or, God forbid, a polycarbonate, very flexible material. And 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, the thing would just be a mess because it wasn't working well. When we started adding these foundation coatings, these base coatings, the durability of our coatings really took right off. And again, this is the difference. What type of coating are you going to use between that lens and the stack of AR? So again, if we look at this, here's our little pictures. Right here, if you notice, here's my hard coating, the adhesive layer, they call it, the lens, the plasma proprietary adhesion layer. These are to keep everything so that there's a little bit of the AR will adhere better than to the bare material, and oftentimes there's a almost like a flexibility or a buffer to it, almost like if this is moving and flexing and this isn't, it'll keep it from crazing as well. Even the best coatings, if you really put it into boiling water and then put it out in the snow, there's still going to be problems with the coating, or people who leave it on their dashboard. Even the very best coatings will still suffer from this, but the better the coating generally, the more durable and less they're going to craze. And a really high-end AR from any company, Hoya, Essilor, Zeiss, any of these different companies, iCoat, independent place, all of them should have some type of proprietary design to try to keep that from crazing. And if you get a really cheap AR, you could apply that AR to the lens, but if what you put it on is not done properly, it's not going to last and it's not going to be durable. And whatever money that your patient thinks they have saved, you're going to have wasted it. Scratching is always an issue, especially with CR39 or polycarbonate, as opposed to glass. Glass is almost probably the most scratch resistant lens material that we use in ophthalmic optics, but we don't use it that often. You can actually add the scratch coat, and from everything that you're told, the scratch coat goes underneath the thin film application. So again, if we look at all of these little diagrams here are our hard coatings. You have the microscopic layers on top, but generally the scratch coat, the hard coating, what keeps it from scratching generally is down towards the bottom, towards the lens, and the thin films are applied on top of that. And generally the better better the scratch resistant coating, the better this foundation coating, this whole series, and everybody's going to do it slightly different, but the better companies have their own little magic formula that if you knew what it was, they'd have to kill you type thing. But again, I would put some of the very best types of coatings from all the different companies. There's always some similarity to what they're doing, just like if you had a BMW, an Audi, and a Mercedes-Benz, they all have great turbos and engines and what have you. They all do a great job, but they all sometimes do it slightly different, but there are some similarities. One of the other issues is if you looked at from a microscopic standpoint, there's a lot of the lenses themselves, the coating themselves, oftentimes would attract more smudges. You'd see more smudges. I had heard one person argue, and still I haven't seen this, but from a microscopic layer, they're almost little crevices for things to get stuck in at a microscopic level. Again, without knowing exactly how that is and how to explain it the best, anti-reflective coatings historically would smudge more. They'd attract more smudges. You see more smudges. They are harder to clean. And so what we ended up doing, what the optical industry ended up doing, is they started putting an additional top coat, and generally they're long chain fluoropolymers, and don't worry about the specifics, but it's a top coat. And what it would do is it would increase the decrease the wettability. It would be water repellent. Some are oil repellent, some are anti-fog, and they all have a different formula, and that's what sometimes separates one from another, one company from another, or how they actually do it. But oleophobic is oil repelling, and hydrophobic, this is more important to me because this is the one that you'll probably hear the most often, is water repelling. And again, this is interesting because we can get into something called wetting angle. And the wetting angle, hydrophobic, is anything that's going to repel water. Hydrophilic is anything that's going to love or attract water. And it's interesting because here, if you just waxed your car and then it gets wet afterwards, the water beads up. If you have Rain-X that you apply to your car, what will end up happening is the little water bead will actually bead up and oftentimes roll right down. You want that on eyeglass lenses. You want it to bead up. You want to really, really, really increase the wetting angle as much as possible. And what the wetting angle is if you put a drop of water on any surface, how much it beads up, either it beads up a lot or it sort of spreads. Well, right from the surface and then right where the edge of the water droplet is, you measure that angle. Well, if I have something that doesn't wet, notice how it beads all the way up, and right where it touches, the angle is an obtuse or a wide open or large angle. If I have something here that's very wettable, the water, the contact angle, as it were, is an acute or a very small angle. Well, curiously enough, we want this in one case of ophthalmic optics, or in eye care rather. We want this in another case. Well, for anti-reflective coatings, we want to make it as hydrophobic as possible so the water beads off and rolls right off. However, since you guys are also in contact lenses, it turns out that something that is very wettable, something that is hydrophilic, something that loves and the surface attracts the water rather, this is what we're trying to do for contact lenses. The more it loves water, the more hydrophilic it is, the more wettable it is, the more slippery it is, the more comfortable it is. We want our contacts to be as good, extra wettability as we possibly can. We want the contact angle to be as low as possible. If we had a contact lens that was like this instead, like a silicone lens, and we talked about silicone and how it's a little bit hydrophobic by its very nature, you'd have this water droplet sort of making it like such, and you're going to have a huge wetting angle. We don't want our contact lenses to have this because then the water beads up, it doesn't flow. You can oftentimes have more friction, less comfortable. So again, good wetting, hydrophilic. This is great for contacts. Poor wetting, hydrophobic, beading up. We like this for our anti-reflective and our lens coatings to make them easier to clean and to be attract fewer deposits in some cases, and essentially have the water bead up and flow right off. And again, ophthalmic lenses, we want non-wetting, hydrophobic. We want it to bead up. For contact lenses, we want it more wettable. We want it to be as hydrophilic as possible. Generally, less friction, more comfortable. You get the idea. All right, and so here, I wanted to show you this video. We just switched over to this, and this is actually a company, and I'll give you the link in a moment if you'd like. But essentially what it is they're talking about the hydrophobic coatings that they can put on lenses. And again, how we do it, it has different applications. Like I said, we do it for Rain-X for our windshields. We can do it with some of these other types of products, but for ophthalmic optics and anti-reflective coatings and how they apply them, oftentimes they can actually just put this little thing here on this top coating so that when the water hits it, it beads right up. You can see how it beads up and eventually falls right off. This is something that does not have that hydrophobic coating. So this would be a non-coated lens. And again, if you were to take a look at that one last time, and I'll give you the video because there's some more stuff that repeats, but this is a hydrophobic where it beads up, and we like that for ophthalmic optics. A traditional lens, notice how it just sort of spreads. It's not as hydrophobic. And this is one of those things where a lot of our anti-reflective coatings, especially the nicer ones with these top hydrophobic coatings, we want it to look like this, like such, for it to bead right up and fall right off, as opposed to sort of stick there and attract the water and sort of, again, this here is really sort of important. And again, when you start seeing hydrophobic on the top, and again, there are different qualities of hydrophobicity. There's different qualities of how long it lasts. There's different quality in how it's applied. Here are the things where, if you're discussing with some of your patients, it makes a big difference. I'll add this here, as a matter of fact, to where we're going to do this later. So give me a moment. Let's go back to my so again, I'll share that little video with you as well. But again, ophthalmic optics and anti-reflective coatings, we do want it hydrophobic. Contact lenses, we want it hydrophilic. Again, how do we apply it? I had the greatest little little video from Essilor. Apparently it's not available, but again, I'll share some videos with you for you to take a look at. And it's very interesting. What they do is some folks, you can actually take a lens and throw it right in, and first, you have to throw some of those hard coats on. And I would argue there are different ways. Anybody who's worked in a lab like a lens crafter, you generally have a spin coat for you grind the lens, the back surface is uncoated, you put it down into a little machine and it spins, and you spray inside a little container. It's very toxic, so you can't get it all over yourself and you have to wear gloves. And as you spray in the back surface and it spins, it sort of spreads out nice and evenly. And then you take it out of the machine, you put it into a UV oven, and it bakes it for about 30 or 45 seconds. So a spin coat UV cure is a pretty quick, simple way to coat a lens. But there are also thermal cured dip coats. So what they do is they dip in a huge rack, they put the lens in, they coat it, it comes out, it's a little wet, and then they put it in a little oven and they end up baking it to dry it out. It's thermal cured with heat. And I would argue that in my experience, and obviously I'm no huge experts in this, I'm not the huge lab guy, and you could talk with different lab folks, but I found that dip coat thermal cures work better, adhere better, provide better scratch resistance, I've done properly, than a spin coat UV cure. And that's just my experience. Vapor deposition, what we end up doing is inside a big, large device, we put the lenses in, and one side is exposed to the bottom, and in there we start putting amounts of silicon dioxide or different types of materials, and we generally hit it with a cathode ray or an electron beam or something to that effect, where it literally, in the machine itself, we vacuum out all the, so there's no air, there's no atmosphere in there, and then we zap the material and it literally vaporizes, and as it vaporizes, it rises, and then it applies to the back surface of the coating, the back surface of the lens, and that's one layer of coat. So you have to make sure you get the right material, you have to put the right amount in, you have to make sure that the right amount has stuck to it, that it's stuck to it consistently. And so that's essentially what all of the, and then you do another version. It spins, you get more of another material of a different index of refraction, of a different thickness, and you zap that, and you keep doing over and over and over. And again, there's different types of applications, but if you ever wanted to look at sputter coats versus cathode arc versus electron beam, you certainly may. But again, these are just, an AR is not an AR is not an AR. Now, this is the, it didn't work. So I'll send you some more links for you to look at. I do like John Seegers and his Laramie K, because he'll show you the whole process from forward to back, start to finish there. But the only thing I would ask you to do is, if you were going to look at some of these numbers, for the optimum index of refraction for our coating, if you just took the material, arguably, theoretically, the square root of the material you're using would give you the ideal index. We don't always have that, so we have to make do, but from a theoretical standpoint, this is important. The optimum thickness for the anti-reflective coating, to make sure that it goes in by a quarter and comes out by a quarter, you'd have to use the wavelength of the light, adjusted for the fact that it was in the material, and then divide that by 4. So, and to get the coating, you just use the regular wavelength divided by the index. That would give you the wavelength of that light color in the coating, and then you divide that by 4, and that would give me the optimum thickness for a specific wavelength, to make sure that if light hits that surface, it will not reflect back at the viewer from outside. Snell's law of refraction, hopefully you've seen that already, because that's just how light bends when it goes from one medium to another. But another one that I really want you to know is the percentage reflectance from a single surface is simply the index of refraction -1 over the index of refraction +1. Take that and square that number, and that gives you the reflection, the amount of light reflected from a single surface. And you can sort of extrapolate out, the higher the index, the more light is reflected, the less light that makes it to the end patient, and the more irritating and more obnoxious the reflections look. So again, in a nutshell, let me stop sharing this. In a nutshell, the anti-reflective, all ARs are not the same. How they're applied, even something as simple as, I've had people who had a brand name. I'm not saying this is a case, but let's say it was a Crizal. Different labs have the same recipe, but even the machines that they use, if they're not calibrated, if they're not maintained, you could have one company that has the same brand coating, maybe for a little bit less, but if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of maintenance, in terms of calibration, what they're putting out is not going to be as high quality as another company, even if it has the same brand name. So you have to look at who it is. You have to see what it costs. You have to see how they're applying it. And one of the things I want to do is, again, is it going to wear well? Is it going to be scratch resistant? Is it going to not craze because it's got a good foundation or buffering coat? Is it a multi-stack? How many stacks? What color is residual? Is there any residual? What's the top coating like? Is it oleophobic? Is it hydrophobic? How long is that going to last? What's the warranty? In some cases, some of these have 1-year manufacturers, and other places I've seen 2 years, no questions asked. They'll replace it because they know they're not going to have to. What you're selling, and here's the frustrating part, if you have your own office and it's private practice, you can choose your lab and you can see what you get. If you're in a corporate, sometimes you're stuck with what they give you because they buy it in bulk or manufacture it in bulk, and you're sort of at that whim in terms of whether it's any good or not. And I'm not saying that corporates are bad, absolutely not. But you have less say over what coatings you can use. And if there's something where it's not as good, again, if you know the difference, it's a material, I'm more interested in, can you tell the difference? So if you go to a Vision Expo East and you talk from one vendor to the other vendor, and you start looking through their marketing and their claims, you can start to see what some of the similarities are, but also what some of the differences are. So what is the difference between an anti-reflective coating that costs the dispenser, and you go to the lab and some of them cost you $20, some of them cost you $65. Well, you may sell one for 25 or 30. You may sell another one for 120 or 130. Well, is there a difference? And I would argue that in many cases, the difference in quality is arguably worth the difference in price. Now, y'all took psychology. Y'all deal with 80% of everything we do is psychological in this field. I would argue with you that The hardest issue for you guys as dispensers, for you folks as dispensers, will be how do you explain that to a patient when they just see something online and they see a frame, lens, and anti-reflective coating for $50 versus your anti-reflective coating that went through all these processes costs you, the dispenser, just the coating costs you more than everything would cost, but it's a different animal. How do you explain that? How can you ex uh, describe that message, describe the quality, describe the application process, and that's generally what's going to separate you from another dispenser. That's what's going to show your patients you know what you're talking about. And potentially, if you do sell better things or a higher quality coating or higher quality lens designs or higher quality made in USA frames, whatever it is you decide to do in your particular area, if you understand how it works, if you understand the background, you'll be able to tell the difference between yours and what someone else may be having. Um, and again, this is just a brief intro. I could go on for weeks on this, but we're just going to make it a short intro, a short unit, if you will. But again, I do want you to have the idea of how they're made, multi-stack, hydrophobic versus hydrophilic, more reflections for a higher index, those types of things, which I think overall are sort of important. And I think I'll call it at that. Maybe we'll have a discussion or some type of what you guys think about what you guys sell or what you've been exposed to or what you like or what you don't like, and then go from there. So anyway, appreciate your time today. Let's wrap it up there, and we will see you shortly.